Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the UK hits the brakes, sort of, on arms to Israel.
We've got to take this as a victory. It's only a partial victory, but it is a victory nonetheless. It's important.
What's London signaling with that move? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Here's how the UK government announced a major change in its support for Israel's war on Gaza, with contrition and at length.
It is with regret that I inform the House today the assessment I have received leaves me unable to conclude anything other than that for certain UK arms exports to Israel, there does exist a clear risk that they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law.
Foreign Secretary David Lammy went on to assure Israel he's not a foe.
Throughout my life, I have been a friend of Israel, a liberal, progressive Zionist who believes in Israel as a democratic state and a homeland for the Jewish people.
The partial arms ban affects parts for fighter jets, helicopters, and drones, but not F-35 jets, which some watchdog groups say are being used to bomb Gaza.
This was not done by convincing some individuals in this ministry. It was done under extreme pressure. They really felt they didn't have any option but to do at least this. And we have to make sure they go further. My name is Nick Dearden. I run a campaign organisation called Global Justice Now, and we are fighting for a more fair, equal and peaceful world.
Love the sound of that, Nick. Welcome to The Take. Let's start with what happened in the UK Parliament this week. Foreign Secretary David Lammy made waves when he stood in front of the Parliament on Monday and announced the UK would be suspending some arms export licenses to Israel, citing a clear risk that they could be used in breaches of international humanitarian law. What were your initial thoughts when you heard this announcement?
So it's taken a very long time for a British government to respond in anything like the way that we think would be appropriate to the absolute horror that's been unfolding in Gaza. And, you know, when you look at the pictures coming out of Gaza, you realise that these exports have been helping Israel in its relentless criminal destruction of Gaza, including the murder of tens of thousands of civilians. So it's important that they have done that. It's important they will no longer be providing those goods. And I think in the very dark time we're living in, we need to celebrate our victories, however small, when they happen. Having said that...
There it is. We don't often get to start our conversations with optimism, so I like that you did that, but here's the caveat. Please continue.
Here's the caveat. I mean, it is only 30 licenses out of 350 licenses that we have open with Israel at the moment. What the government's tried to do here is make a distinction between things that are offensive and things that are defensive. So they have been at pains to stress Israel has a right to defend itself, and they have defined most of the stuff that we send to Israel, even though they are in one way or another military exports, to define them as defensive and to say, look, Israel may need these because it may come under attack from neighboring countries, from Hezbollah or from Iran or wherever, and therefore we need to keep sending these. Now, we think that distinction, given the gravity of what is happening in Gaza at the moment, is completely meaningless. And in particular, we are still providing parts for F-35 fighter jets, the most lethal fighter jet in the world, according to Lockheed Martin, its manufacturer. We export those to the United States, where they are turned into the full fighter jet, and they are then exported on to Israel. We know those things have been used extensively in Gaza. We have evidence of that. And, you know, that's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there is all sorts of, you know, British military bases on Cyprus, we believe, have been used by the Americans to send military equipment into Israel. There are reports of British spy planes in the area that have potentially been assisting Israel. The depth of military cooperation is huge.
So this begs the question then, why do this at all? Because, as you mentioned, that caveat there, Secretary Lammy was clear with what this decision is and what it's not. And it seems like he's walking a tightrope almost.
Third, this is not a blanket ban. This is not an arms embargo.
But we also have Lamy saying he's a Zionist who stands with Israel, and then announcing, as you said, that this only affects 30 out of 350 arms licenses. That's reportedly less than 1% of Israel's total weapons imports. So what is the UK's motivation here? Who are they trying to please with this decision?
So the UK government has been under enormous pressure for this whole year. I mean, public opinion in this country is very clear that we should not be exporting arms at this time to Israel for very obvious reasons. Most people do not enjoy watching a genocide and do not want to believe that their government is complicit in that genocide. Of course, that public opinion, as you might expect, is particularly strong towards the left of the political spectrum. And I don't actually think it's about politics, and it's a widely shared view. But certainly, if you look at the backgrounds of many of the new Labour members of Parliament who've come in, they are likely to be more susceptible to that pressure than the Conservative government previously. And they felt, I think, that they had to do something as a result of that pressure. And in particular, they have come under direct legal challenge. So there are organisations that have them in court at the moment saying, you need to review your actions because it's not consistent with our own law, with our own legal system that you're exporting this stuff. We released a report just a couple of weeks ago from a top barrister here saying, look, you personally may be liable for this. That's the scale of the human rights abuses that we're talking about, mean that you, senior civil servants and ministers, may be liable for this. And only a couple of weeks ago, a senior civil servant who has been responsible for working on arms control and so on resigned. He said, I cannot do this job any longer, and I am extremely sad to be resigning, but I am not being listened to here. So I think they recognised that there were going to be consequences for the government and potentially for them personally if they didn't do something.
So they did something, but why didn't they just ban arms to Israel altogether?
Yeah, and that's the key question, isn't it? And I think there are two reasons. I mean, one, you've seen from the way that Secretary Lamy spoke about Israel and his liberal Zionism and whatever, he is desperate not to upset Israel too much. And I think there are various reasons for that. But in particular, we have very, very close economic, defense and military cooperation with Israel because Israel has cutting-edge technologies that are used in population control. And they are war-tested. And they are being war-tested in Gaza at this moment. And we do not want to cut ourselves off from those technologies. So I think that's one reason. I think the other reason is, frankly, the United States and a desperation on the part of this government not to upset the United States administration, not to upset a potential Trump administration in the future. So Trump's national security secretary was over in London just last week, and he was warning there would be dire consequences if the UK went too far. But whether we have a government or the right or the left, they have tended to toe that line. And they knew that the United States was urging them not to go too far.
After the break, if this partial arms ban is not enough, what would be? Nick, you know that you wrote in a tweet recently, there are big reasons why Britain has been so bad on the genocide in Gaza, including deep strategic subservience to the US. Do you think the UK, now led by the Labour Party, is breaking that subservience at least a little bit?
I have to be honest, I don't think it is. I don't think there is any willingness in this administration to break the subservience with the US. The political class in this country, as I say, whether it be represented by a Labour government or a Conservative government, has recognised since the Second World War that part of this country's prestige and power in the world comes from being a subservient power to the US. A junior partner, as they like to put it, a lapdog or a poodle, as we often call it. To say we have no independent foreign policy. I mean, the country is littered with American bases, and they see that as a way of maintaining power and prestige in the world. I think that is bad. I think it is bad because it means that we are complicit in all manner of horrific military operations and human rights abuses around the world. You only need to look at Tony Blair and George Bush in Iraq and the opposition they engendered in this country. So I think as things stand at the moment, they are desperate to walk a tightrope, as you've said, that does not upset the senior partner in our relationship too much. And so the idea of an independent foreign policy is severely constrained. And as I say, I personally think that that's one of the big battles ahead for the movement in this country and those who want to see a different way of working in this country, that we actually develop an independent foreign policy at long last.
Wow. Okay, well then, speaking of walking that tightrope, to just keep that analogy going, are they succeeding? Because as we know, that's a very hard thing to do. It takes immense skill. Are they succeeding, or are they just angering everyone?
Yeah, I think that's the concern. I mean, the opposition spokesperson, Andrew Mitchell, said after David Lammy made his announcement, you are trying not to upset Israel too much at the same time as to please some of the people who are really angry at the moment. I fear you will succeed in neither. And I think that precisely is what we may be looking at. We know Israel was deeply unhappy with Britain's decision, as they should have been, I believe, because it speaks volumes about the level of barbarity that they are committing in Gaza at this moment, but they were not at all happy. At the same time, the vast majority of people who've been campaigning on this think it is too little, too late, and they need to go much, much further.
Well, speaking of the Israeli response, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemned the ban and called it shameful, you mentioned. He wrote on X, tweeting, "With or without British arms, Israel will win this war." So that is the view from Israel. But I want to shift to another point you raised, which is the people, what would be good for the people of the UK, because the UK has seen some of the biggest pro-Palestine marches in its history in recent months. They're still continuing.
This is now pro-Palestinian demonstration number 15 in London. And the campaigners, the marchers, are trying to keep the momentum going, keep that pressure on the politicians.
This comes alongside those resignations that you mentioned earlier from UK officials over arms sales to Israel. And now we're seeing this partial ban. Do you think that the government is coming into step with public opinion when it comes to the UK's policy here? Or could this be the first step to a larger shift in policy?
Look, I think that's what we've got to make sure happens. And this is really important. And, for any listeners in the region and in Palestine, do not judge the opinions of the British people by the actions of the British government on this. What is happening at the moment in Gaza has completely horrified a very large segment of our society, reaching well beyond people who are normally involved in politics or normally critical of foreign policy. We're watching a genocide being live streamed, after all, and most people don't like that and don't want to see it and don't want to be involved in it. At the last election, despite the fact that this government has risen to power on a landslide, essentially because the last government was so deeply unpopular, nonetheless, 5 independents were elected to Parliament, eroding what should have been completely safe Labour seats. Several other members, including the front bench of the new administration, were run extremely close by independents running purely on a Gaza platform. And as you say, we've had absolutely enormous demonstrations. I mean, at the beginning, the only thing I can compare it to in my lifetime were the demonstrations against the Iraq War, when that first started. And, it is not often in this country that foreign policy fundamentally changes how people feel about a government. The Iraq War was one of those occasions, but I would say this is another of those occasions where really the Labour Party has only been in office for a few weeks. It has enjoyed no honeymoon period whatsoever, and there are several reasons for that, but we shouldn't underestimate the importance of Gaza and their position on Gaza in that. They have seriously annoyed and upset a really significant part of their base on this. And so what we need to do is keep up that pressure, and I don't see any sign whatsoever that that's going to be stopping anytime soon.
Nick, you are campaigning for global justice, for an end to the war in Gaza, and imposing a full arms embargo on Israel. You wrote in a recent op-ed on al-Jazeera.com a line that really has stuck with me ever since I read it. Gaza has become a human rights-free zone where history's first live-stream genocide is taking place. Human rights-free zone just really gives you chills. If this partial arms ban is not enough, what precisely would be?
So first of all, I think a complete arms embargo should almost be a given at this point. There is no way whatsoever that we should be supporting a military engaged in the most serious human rights abuses you can imagine, up to and including genocide. That's just, I think, obvious, and we need to see that yesterday. But actually, I think we should go further. This country is very interested, our government is very interested in pursuing closer economic ties with Israel, including they've announced negotiations on a new deeper trade agreement need to proceed as a priority. That, I believe, is completely wrong. For me, this tells us that our government is interested in a deeper economic and military relationship with Israel. We've got to stop it. We can't end an arms embargo. We've got to say the behavior that Israel has shown in Gaza has no place in a civilized world. It has no place when Israel does it, but it has no place when anyone does it. Any government does it. And if we're to stop those kinds of human rights abuses, if we're to stop those kind of war crimes, we need to take a really strong position on that. So I hope that some of what we've done here will give strength to the boycott, sanctions and divestment movement, because just as in South Africa in the early 1980s, if we allow this kind of behavior to go unchallenged and unquestioned, we are next. We are next. It may be extreme what's happening in Gaza, but at some level, this is a threat to every individual on the planet who wants to live in a different, more peaceful and more democratic world.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Sarí el-Khalili, Amy Walters, and Tamara Khandaker, with Shraddha Joshi, Hagir Saleh, Duha Mosaad, Phillip Lanos, Hisham Abu Salah, and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Joe Plourde mixed this episode. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.